It is the morning of December 22nd, 1944. A German staff car approaches American lines outside the Belgian town of Bastogne, a white flag fluttering from its antenna. 4 German emissaries carry a formal ultimatum demanding the surrender of the American forces trapped inside. The situation is desperate. 11,000 American soldiers are completely surrounded, ammunition is running low, medical supplies are nearly gone, and no relief column is in sight. The German message offers 2 choices: honorable surrender or total annihilation. The ultimatum is carried to the acting division commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. His reply will become legend. But to understand the impossible position these men found themselves in, we must go back 6 days, to the moment the German army shocked the world and shattered the Allied front. By December 1944, Nazi Germany was losing the war. The Allies had broken out of Normandy and liberated Paris. American and British bombers pounded German cities day and night. The Third Reich was being crushed from both sides, and everyone knew it. Everyone except Adolf Hitler. In the autumn of that year, Hitler conceived a desperate gamble. He would gather his remaining reserves, launch a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, split the Allied armies in 2, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. If successful, the offensive might force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to turn its full attention to the Soviet threat in the East. His generals were skeptical. Germany lacked the fuel, the manpower, and the air cover for such an ambitious operation. But Hitler overruled them all. The attack would proceed under the codename Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. The Ardennes seemed an unlikely place for a major offensive. The region was heavily forested, crisscrossed by narrow roads and covered in snow and fog during winter. Allied commanders considered it a quiet sector, a place to rest exhausted divisions and train new ones. The American units holding the Ardennes line were a mix of green troops who had never seen combat and battered veterans recovering from earlier fighting. Intelligence officers noted increased German activity across the front, but dismissed it as defensive preparations. No one believed the Germans capable of launching a major attack. They were wrong. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, more than 200,000 German soldiers, supported by 600 tanks and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, fell upon the unsuspecting American line. The barrage came without warning. Shells screamed through the frozen forest, shattering trees and bunkers alike. Then the German infantry and armor surged forward through the gaps. The effect was devastating. Along an 80-mile front, American units were overwhelmed. Communications collapsed. Commanders lost contact with their men. Entire regiments simply vanished into the fog and chaos. The 106th Infantry Division, positioned in the Schnee-Eifel salient, was surrounded within days. Nearly 8,000 American soldiers surrendered, one of the largest mass capitulations in American military history. As the scale of the disaster became clear, Allied commanders scrambled to respond. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, immediately recognized the threat. This was no local spoiling attack. This was a full-scale offensive aimed at splitting his armies. Eisenhower ordered every available reserve to move toward the breakthrough. Among those reserves was the 101st Airborne Division, resting at Mourmelon-le-Grand in France after the bloody fighting at Arnhem during Operation Market Garden. The paratroopers had earned a brief respite. It would not last. On the night of December 17th, the order came. The 101st was to move immediately to a small Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne. Looking at a map, the reason was obvious. 7 major roads converged at Bastogne like spokes on a wheel. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the road network. Without it, the German advance could not be sustained. With it, they could pour men and supplies westward toward their ultimate objective. The Americans had to get there first. The division loaded onto trucks in darkness and confusion. Many soldiers lacked winter clothing, some had no weapons. Ammunition was in short supply. No one knew exactly where the front was or what they would find when they arrived. One paratrooper later recalled, "We did not know where we were going or what we would find when we got there. All we knew was the Germans had broken through somewhere, and we were heading toward the sound of the guns." They traveled more than 100 miles through fog-shrouded roads clogged with retreating vehicles and refugees. It was a journey into the unknown. The division's commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington attending a conference. In his absence, command fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander. McAuliffe was 46 years old, a West Point graduate who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day. He was known for his calm demeanor under pressure, a man who never seemed rattled no matter how desperate the situation. Now he was leading 11,000 paratroopers into a battle none of them fully understood against an enemy whose strength and location remained a mystery. The first American forces to reach Bastogne were not the paratroopers, but elements of Combat Command B from the 10th Armored Division. These tank crews and armored infantrymen immediately fanned out to form blocking teams on the roads leading into town. Team Cherry deployed to the east. Team de Sobry moved north to the village of Noville. Team O'Hara covered the southern approaches. These small forces, numbering only a few hundred men each, would have to hold off the advancing German panzers until the 101st arrived and dug in. The German forces converging on Bastogne were formidable. The 47th Panzer Corps, commanded by General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, included the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and the elite Panzer Lehr Division. Von Luttwitz was an experienced commander who understood the importance of Bastogne to the entire offensive. His orders were clear: take the crossroads quickly and keep the advance moving. He had no intention of getting bogged down in a prolonged siege. Over the next 3 days, fierce fighting erupted on the roads around Bastogne. At Noville, Team de Sobry engaged German tanks in a running battle that cost both sides dearly. The village changed hands multiple times. At Longville to the east, Team Cherry was overwhelmed by German armor, its remnants fighting their way back to American lines. At Warden in the south, another desperate engagement. The blocking teams were being ground down, but they were buying the 101st precious hours. By December 19th, the paratroopers had arrived and begun digging foxholes in the frozen earth around Bastogne. They were just in time. The German pincers closed with methodical precision. From the north, east, and south, von Luttwitz's forces pushed inward, seizing village after village, cutting road after road. On December 20th, the last highway to the east was threatened. By the 21st, it was gone. The encirclement was complete. 11,000 American soldiers, along with hundreds of vehicles and artillery pieces, were now trapped inside a shrinking perimeter. The Siege of Bastogne had begun. Inside the pocket, McAuliffe took stock of his situation. The arithmetic was grim. He had enough artillery ammunition for perhaps 3 more days of serious fighting if he rationed it carefully. Medical supplies were critically low, and wounded men could not be evacuated. Food was already on short rations. Worse still, the same fog and snow that had allowed the Germans to achieve surprise now grounded Allied aircraft. There would be no air support, no resupply drops, no fighter bombers to break up German columns. The men of Bastogne were on their own. And then, on the morning of December 22nd, 4 figures appeared on the road outside the perimeter, walking slowly toward American lines under a white flag. The 4 Germans approached slowly, their white flag visible against the gray December sky. 2 officers and 2 enlisted men, walking with deliberate formality toward the American outpost near the village of Marvy. They were stopped by soldiers from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and blindfolded before being led to a farmhouse, serving as a company command post. The senior German officer carried a typed document in a leather case. He requested that it be delivered to the American commanding general immediately. The message was from General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. The ultimatum was formal, almost courteous in its language. but its meaning was unmistakable. It began by acknowledging the fortune of war that had placed the American forces in a hopeless position. German artillery was in position to annihilate the town. The American troops had no possibility of relief. To save the encircled forces from total destruction, the German commander offered honorable surrender. All wounded would receive medical care. The alternative, the document warned, would be the complete annihilation of the American garrison and the civilian population of Bastogne. The Americans were given 2 hours to respond. The message was carried up the chain of command until it reached the basement of the Belgian barracks where McAuliffe had established his headquarters. When an aide first told him that German officers had arrived with a surrender demand, McAuliffe was initially confused. His first thought was that the Germans wanted to surrender to him. When he realized the truth, that the enemy was demanding his capitulation, he laughed out loud. He read the ultimatum, shook his head, and muttered, "Ah, nuts." Then he dropped the paper on his desk and turned his attention back to the tactical situation around the perimeter. His staff officers exchanged glances. A response was required. The Germans were waiting. McAuliffe asked what he should say. Colonel Harry Kennard, the division operations officer, spoke up. "That first remark of yours would be hard to beat, General." McAuliffe looked puzzled for a moment, then understood. He sat down and wrote a single word on a piece of paper. The formal American reply to the German demand for surrender consisted of 4 letters. Nuts! Colonel Joseph Harper, commander of the 327th Glider Infantry, was given the task of delivering the response. He drove to where the blindfolded German emissaries waited and handed the paper to the senior officer. The German read it and looked up, clearly confused. "Is this reply negative or affirmative?" he asked. "If it is the latter, I will negotiate further." Harper had no patience for formality. "The reply is decidedly not affirmative," he said. Then he added, "If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The German officer still did not understand the American slang. Harper made it plain. It means the same as go to hell. The emissaries were escorted back to German lines. Within hours, every American soldier in Bastogne knew what their commander had said. The word spread through foxholes and aid stations, through command posts and artillery positions. Morale, which had been flagging under the weight of encirclement and dwindling supplies, surged. They were not going to surrender. They were going to fight. McAuliffe's single word had given them something to hold on to. The Germans wasted no time making good on their threat. On the afternoon of December 22nd, artillery and mortar fire intensified across the perimeter. That night, probing attacks tested American positions at multiple points. The defenders held, but the pressure was relentless. Over the next 2 days, the fighting grew fiercer. German infantry, supported by tanks, struck from the west near the village of Champs, from the south at Marvy, and from the east along the Martesson Ridge. Each attack was met with desperate resistance. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion fought a series of critical engagements around the perimeter. Their M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, fast but lightly armored, stalked German panzers through the frozen landscape. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Gruber, the battalion commander, positioned his vehicles carefully, knowing that every round had to count. Ammunition was too scarce to waste. Bazooka teams from the Airborne regiments hunted German tanks at close range, waiting until the last possible moment to fire, then displacing before the enemy could respond. It was a deadly game played in snow and darkness. The artillery situation remained critical. American batteries were limited to 10 rounds per gun per day, sometimes fewer. Counter-battery fire against German positions was nearly impossible. The gunners had to choose their targets with agonizing precision, saving their shells for moments when massed German infantry presented unmissable opportunities. Every round that left the barrel brought them closer to having no ammunition at all. Beyond the fighting, the cold itself became an enemy. Temperatures dropped well below zero. Men in foxholes wrapped themselves in anything they could find. Burlap sacks, blankets taken from ruined houses, even German uniforms stripped from the dead. Frostbite claimed casualties that never appeared in combat reports. Trench foot spread through the ranks, as soldiers stood for hours in frozen holes that filled with ice and snow. Some men huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat to survive another night. The wounded suffered most of all. Aid stations overflowed with casualties who could not be evacuated. Surgeons operated by candlelight, without adequate anesthesia, their supplies exhausted days earlier. Men died of wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care. The chaplains moved among the wounded, offering what comfort they could. In the cellars of Bastogne, Belgian civilians sheltered from the bombardment, their homes destroyed, their fate bound to the American soldiers fighting above them. Food grew scarce for soldiers and civilians alike. Everyone was hungry, everyone was cold, and still the Germans came. Meanwhile, relief was fighting its way north. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army to the south, had made a promise. On December 19th, at a meeting with Eisenhower and other senior commanders, Patton declared that he could redirect his entire army and attack toward Bastogne within 48 hours. The other generals were skeptical. Moving 3 divisions in the middle of winter, changing their axis of advance by 90 degrees, seemed logistically impossible. But Patton had already begun planning. His staff had worked through the night preparing orders. When Eisenhower gave the word, the Third Army would move. The 4th Armored Division led the relief effort, pushing north through German resistance, icy roads, and demolished bridges. They fought through villages whose names meant nothing to anyone who had not bled there. Progress was measured in miles per day, sometimes less. The Germans defending the corridor knew what was at stake and contested every crossroads. Inside Bastogne, the defenders had no way of knowing if relief would come in time. They knew only that they had to hold. On December 23rd, after days of impenetrable fog and freezing overcast, the men in Bastogne looked up and saw something that made them cheer. Blue sky. Patches of clear weather breaking through the clouds for the first time since the offensive began. The weather was finally turning, and with it, everything was about to change. The sound came first, a distant droning that grew steadily louder, rising above the crack of rifle fire and the thump of artillery. Men in foxholes stopped and listened, their breath hanging in the frozen air. Then, someone shouted and pointed skyward. Through the broken clouds, aircraft were descending toward Bastogne. American aircraft. P-47 Thunderbolts peeled off and dove toward German positions, their guns blazing, their bombs falling on enemy columns caught in the open. The effect on morale was electric. After days of fighting alone under gray skies, the men of Bastogne were no longer abandoned. But the fighter-bombers were only the beginning. Behind them came the transports, C-47 cargo planes, more than 140 of them, flying in formation toward the besieged town. As they passed overhead, the sky filled with parachutes. Red, yellow, blue, and white canopies blossomed and drifted down, each color indicating a different type of supply. Ammunition, medical equipment, food. Soldiers scrambled from their positions to collect the bundles, racing against time and German artillery that tried to disrupt the recovery. Some supplies landed in German-held territory and were lost, but most fell within American lines. The transformation was immediate. Artillery batteries that had been rationing shells suddenly had ammunition to fight back. Aid stations received desperately needed medical supplies. Hungry men ate their first full meal in days. On December 24th, another massive resupply drop followed. The C-47s returned with more ammunition, more food, more of everything the defenders needed to continue the fight. The siege was not broken, but, for the first time since the encirclement began, the men of Bastogne believed they might survive it. That night, Christmas Eve, brought a brief and bitter respite. The fighting slowed as darkness fell, though German artillery continued its harassment fire. Then came the bombers. Luftwaffe aircraft, rare visitors to a sky now dominated by Allied fighters, struck Bastogne after nightfall. One bomb made a direct hit on a medical aid station in the town center. The explosion killed 30 people, including a Belgian nurse named Augusta Chewy who had volunteered to help the American wounded. The building collapsed in flames, and the screams of the dying echoed through the rubble. Despite the horror, Christmas was observed. In cellars and foxholes, men shared what little they had. Chaplains held services by candlelight, their congregations of exhausted soldiers bowing their heads in prayer. General McAuliffe issued a Christmas message to his troops. He told them that the enemy had received only a Merry Christmas from the defenders of Bastogne, and he asked them to help deliver a Happy New Year. The message was distributed throughout the perimeter, read aloud in command posts, and passed from man to man. It reminded them why they were fighting and what they had already accomplished. But there was no illusion about what lay ahead. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans were massing for a major assault. The next day would bring the hardest fighting yet. Christmas morning dawned cold and clear. The Germans attacked before full light. From the west, near the village of Champs, 18 tanks from the 15th Panzergrenadier Division rolled forward, supported by waves of infantry. Simultaneously, another assault struck from the southeast. The western attack was the most dangerous. The German armor found a seam in the American line and pushed through, panzers grinding past the outer defenses and driving toward the heart of Bastogne. For a few terrible hours, it seemed the perimeter might collapse. The breakthrough at Champs was chaos. German tanks rumbled through the village streets, their machine guns raking American positions, their cannons blasting buildings where paratroopers had taken cover. One German column advanced to within a few hundred yards of McAuliffe's command post. Officers drew their sidearms and prepared to defend the headquarters. If the Germans reached the command post and killed or captured the division leadership, the defense of Bastogne would crumble. But the paratroopers did not break. Tank destroyers from the 705th rushed to meet the German armor. Bazooka teams stalked the panzers through the snow, firing at close range and then scrambling for cover. American artillery, finally supplied with adequate ammunition, rained shells on the advancing Germans. One tank destroyer, commanded by Sergeant Lawrence Felita, engaged multiple German tanks in a running fight through the outskirts of Champs, destroying 2 before his vehicle was knocked out. He and his crew escaped and continued fighting on foot. At the village itself, the fighting became hand-to-hand. German infantry had infiltrated American positions, and the paratroopers counterattacked with fixed bayonets. One soldier from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment later recalled the moment. "We did not have time to think. We just ran at them screaming and stuck them with whatever we had." The close-quarters battle raged through the morning, small groups of men fighting in snow-covered fields and ruined buildings, the distinction between front line and rear area disappearing entirely. By afternoon, the tide had turned. The German assault had spent itself against the American defense. 18 German tanks lay destroyed or abandoned around Champs. Hundreds of German soldiers had been killed or captured. The perimeter, battered and bloodied, still held. The Christmas Day attack, the largest and most determined German effort to take Bastogne, had failed. The defenders had won their most important victory of the siege. While Bastogne held, the relief force was fighting its way north. Patton's 4th Armored Division had been pushing through German resistance for days, paying for every mile in blood. The Germans knew that if Bastogne was relieved, their entire offensive would stall. They defended the approaches with everything they had. Demolished bridges slowed the American advance. Ambushes took their toll on tank crews and infantry. Progress was measured in hours and casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the lead task force. He was an aggressive tanker, the kind of officer who led from the front and pushed his men relentlessly. On December 26th, his column reached the village of Assenois, just a few miles from the Bastogne perimeter. The village was defended. Abrams did not wait for a coordinated assault. He ordered his tanks to charge straight through, guns blazing, crushing everything in their path. The gamble worked. The tanks burst through the German defenses and kept moving. At 4:50 in the afternoon, the lead tank from the 37th Tank Battalion made contact with the 101st Airborne. The vehicle was commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Bogus. As he approached the American lines, paratroopers emerged from their foxholes to meet him. Bogus called out, "Come here to see if you guys need any help." A paratrooper replied, "We are glad to see you." The siege of Bastogne was broken. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for a single road, and it would be contested for days to come. But it was enough. That night, ambulances began evacuating the wounded who had waited so long for rescue. Supplies flowed into the town. Fresh troops moved up to reinforce the exhausted defenders. Bastogne would never be cut off again. The siege was over. But the cost of those 7 days and the weeks of fighting still to come would not be fully known until the guns finally fell silent. The relief of Bastogne did not end the fighting, it only changed its character. The narrow corridor opened by the 4th Armored Division became a lifeline that the Germans were determined to sever. For days after the link-up, fierce battles raged along the flanks of the corridor as enemy forces tried to close the gap and restore the siege. American reinforcements poured through the opening, while German artillery pounded the single road connecting Bastogne to the outside world. The town remained a battlefield even after the encirclement was broken. The struggle for Bastogne continued into January 1945. American forces gradually expanded the perimeter, pushing the Germans back village by village, ridge by ridge. The Bulge itself, the great salient the German offensive had driven into Allied lines, was not fully eliminated until the end of January. By then, the Ardennes had consumed resources that neither side could easily replace. But the cost fell far more heavily on the Germans. The American casualties at Bastogne were severe. Approximately 3,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, or listed as missing during the siege and the immediate fighting that followed. The 101st Airborne Division alone suffered around 1,500 casualties. Some rifle companies that had entered Bastogne at full strength emerged with barely enough men to form a platoon. The cold claimed victims that never appeared on casualty lists, men whose frostbitten feet and frozen hands would trouble them for the rest of their lives. German losses around Bastogne were far greater. Estimates vary, but between 8,000 and 12,000 German soldiers became casualties in the attempts to take or isolate the town. Dozens of tanks and armored vehicles littered the fields and roads around the perimeter, destroyed by American tank destroyers, artillery, and aircraft once the weather cleared. The 47th Panzer Corps, which had been ordered to seize Bastogne quickly and continue west, was instead ground down in a siege it could not win. The town itself bore terrible scars. More than 700 buildings in Bastogne were destroyed or severely damaged by artillery fire and bombing. Belgian civilians who had sheltered in cellars emerged to find their homes reduced to rubble. At least 200 civilians died during the siege, killed by German shells, American bombs that fell short, or simply caught in the crossfire of a battle they had never asked to join. The people of Bastogne had endured alongside their liberators, and they would carry the memory of that shared suffering for generations. The men who led the defense and relief of Bastogne emerged from the battle as legends. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the siege. His single-word reply to the German surrender demand became one of the most famous quotations of the Second World War. For the rest of his life, McAuliffe would be associated with that one defiant word. He continued his military career after the war, eventually rising to the rank of full general and commanding United States Army Europe. He died in 1975, but the story of his response at Bastogne outlived him. General George Patton's relief of Bastogne cemented his reputation as the most aggressive and successful American field commander of the war. The speed with which he redirected the Third Army and drove north through German resistance was considered one of the greatest logistical achievements of the conflict. Patton continued to lead the Third Army until the German surrender in May 1945. 7 months later, in December, he died from injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany. He never saw the peacetime world his soldiers had fought to create. General Heinrich von Luttwitz survived the war. His corps was badly mauled in the failed Ardennes offensive, and he spent the final months of the conflict trying to hold together a crumbling front. In his post-war memoirs, he acknowledged the tenacity of the American defense at Bastogne. The resistance he encountered there, he wrote, was far stronger than German intelligence had predicted. The American paratroopers had fought with a determination that surprised even experienced German officers. Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams, who led the task force that broke through to Bastogne, went on to a distinguished military career. He served in Korea and Vietnam, eventually becoming Army Chief of Staff. When the United States developed a new main battle tank in the 1970s, it was named the M1 Abrams in his honor. He died in 1974, but his name rides into battle on American tanks to this day. The 101st Airborne Division received a Presidential Distinguished Unit citation for its defense of Bastogne, the first time an entire division had been so honored. The citation praised the division for holding a vital position against tremendous odds, maintaining its integrity and fighting spirit despite being completely cut off from supporting forces. Bastogne became central to the division's identity, a touchstone of pride and sacrifice that defined the unit for generations of soldiers who followed. For the Germans, the failure at Bastogne was a strategic catastrophe. The entire purpose of the Ardennes offensive had been to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. Without control of the road junction at Bastogne, German supply lines were strangled. Units ran out of fuel within sight of their objectives. The offensive that was supposed to change the course of the war instead consumed Germany's last strategic reserves for no meaningful gain. The Battle of the Bulge cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties and irreplaceable quantities of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Those resources could not be replaced, and they could not defend against the Soviet offensive that burst across the Eastern Front in January. German commanders understood what had happened. General Fritz Bayerlein of the Panzer-Lehr Division called the American resistance at Bastogne remarkable. The defenders had done more than hold the town. They had broken the momentum of the entire German attack at the moment it needed momentum most. Every day the Americans held Bastogne was a day the German timetable slipped further behind. By the time the siege was lifted, the offensive had lost whatever chance of success it might have had. Bastogne mattered because it proved something that would resonate through the final months of the war. It demonstrated that surrounded American troops, properly led and determined to fight, could hold against superior numbers. It showed that airborne forces designed for offensive operations could anchor a desperate defense. It revealed the limits of German power even in their final desperate gamble. And it gave the American public a story of defiance and courage at a moment when the news from Europe had turned suddenly dark. The veterans of Bastogne carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. They formed bonds that peacetime could not break, the kind of connection that only shared suffering creates. For decades, survivors gathered at reunions to remember the friends they had lost and the impossible odds they had overcome. They returned to Bastogne, walking the fields where they had frozen in their foxholes, visiting the graves of those who never came home. The people of Bastogne welcomed them as liberators and friends, a relationship that endured across generations. Today, the Martyrs' Memorial rises on a hill outside Bastogne, a star-shaped monument inscribed with the names of the American states whose sons fought and died there. Belgian schoolchildren still visit American cemeteries to place flowers on the graves of soldiers who fell in the winter of 1944. The last veterans of the siege have now passed away, their voices silenced by time. But their story endures in monuments and memorials, in histories and documentaries, in the simple word that one general spoke when asked to surrender. In the bitter cold of December 1944, a small town in Belgium became the place where the German army's last great offensive was stopped. The men who held Bastogne did not know they would become legends. They only knew they had to hold. They were cold and hungry and running out of ammunition. They were surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered them and outgunned them. And when that enemy demanded their surrender, their commander answered with a single word that captured everything they were fighting for: defiance, determination, an absolute refusal to quit. Today, the roads still converge at Bastogne. The town has been rebuilt. The Martyrs' Memorial rises above the fields where American paratroopers once froze in their foxholes, waiting for relief that might never come. The veterans are gone now, their voices silenced by time, but the word remains. Nuts. It meant we will not surrender, we will not break, we will hold the line.